Excel sheet?
I did.
Anything else not received? Okay, let me see if I can send it now. Check your junk folder. Sometimes, for some reason, they get labeled as.
I just saw it.
Switch over.
It's from going backward.
Yep.
That's why. Like 60 days. Because you earn 60 days to get restore credit. Okay.
Variation.
It's not as good as Wi-Fi.
All right. Go ahead and pull up the front door, back door spreadsheet that I sent to you, I believe, yesterday. The blank version.
That's not something to get.
Yeah, it's like, you know.
Okay, so I got it pulled up.
New laptop for this one.
Okay, everybody got a copy of the handout? One-page handout. Yep. Okay, so here's the plan for today. This is what I call a simple financial feasibility analysis model, okay? And so that's what the SFFA stands for, okay? The two approaches are the front door approach and the back door approach. Now, normally, whenever I teach the development class, the development process class, this is usually one of the first things that I start out with. And this is probably, actually I'm not going to say probably, I would say this is probably the most important model of the entire program, okay? This is literally where everything all fits together in one nice little package of whenever you're trying to make the decision as to potentially proceed with a project or to push it off to the side and say it's it's really not feasible, okay? So what we do with this model is we collect information. Specifically, we collect information related to the size of the property, the purchase price of the property, the purchase price of the land, if we are building from ground up. We also need to collect, things like what the occupancy or vacancy rate is for this particular property type. We need to collect what the rental rates are per square foot for the property type. We need to be able to collect, what the lending criteria for the property is going to be, what sort of loan to value, what sort of interest rate, what sort of term. And we need to sort of take into consideration what maybe operating expenses are going to be with the property, what our debt service coverage ratio is going to be, and a couple of other variables. So there's literally 10 or so different variables that we need to kind of collect. And then once we've collected those variables for a particular property, we're able to put them into a model like this and be able to very easily sort of spit out something that's going to be useful to us. Well, with the model on the top, what we're doing is it sort of terms it the front door approach, we're starting with, okay, here's what our site is going to cost us in terms of the site acquisition. So let me blow this up a little bit so once again folks can maybe see it a little bit easier. Blow the top part here.
So is this like a pro forma?
No. The top part is not. The bottom part sort of is. Okay, so once again, the first variable that we start off with the front door approach is we start off with what is basically the land cost, the site acquisition piece, okay? Now with this, I tend to go ahead and put in with the site acquisition cost any other sort of fees associated with, like if you've got to get it rezoned, if you've got to basically get it replatted, if you've got to come in and do some dirt work and you know, infrastructure, all that sort of stuff. To me, that is the site acquisition cost. Okay, so it's the land cost plus all those other sort of costs to get the dirt ready to build on. Then construction cost, I then typically sort of say that those are the costs affiliated with actually building whatever the structure is. Okay, from in this case, you know, kind of from a slab all the way up. Okay, so that's kind of how I break it out. Now, granted, you can get much more sophisticated than that, but these are, for the most part, rough numbers, okay? These are not meant to be the super precise numbers that are going to go into a more detailed kind of analysis or pro forma, okay? This is what I like to call, this is kind of the first blush. This is the sort of thing that you collect some very basic pieces of information and you're able to make the initial sort of go, no-go kind of decision, okay? Does that make sense to everybody? So, what this model does is you can see over here on the left-hand side, the math is already there for you, okay, telling you what you need to do, whether you need to add, subtract, multiply, divide, or whatever. In other words, site acquisition cost plus construction cost equal total expected development cost. Make sense? Okay? So, and then the next line down, multiply that by the loan to value ratio, that's going to give us our permanent mortgage. Multiply that by our annualized mortgage constant, that's going to give us the cash required for our debt service, and so forth, so on, all the way down the page. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through, we're going to put in some numbers, we're going to test it, and then talk about, you know, kind of each of those variables as we kind of go through the process. Does that make sense, everybody? But the end result of this first model, the front door approach, is putting in all that information, gets us down to this line 17, which is, in essence, what we're really searching for, which is what would be the rent required per square foot for this property to basically work for us, given all of those preconditions. So, before even putting any numbers up there, let's say that the rent required per square foot, based upon this model, is $15. Okay? So I want you to think with me for a second. So let's say the number that gets shot back here is $15 per square foot for the rent required per square foot for this particular property. So if we go out into the market and we find similar properties, and all of those properties are leasing at $20 a square foot, what does that say about this particular property that we're analyzing? What?
Feasible.
It's very feasible, because we've got a $5 gap, if you will, because we only need to get $15 a square foot, but the market on average is $20 a square foot. So without question, we're probably sitting on a project that makes a lot of sense. Okay? On the flip side, if we go out into the market and the average property is at $10 a square foot, okay, in terms of lease rates, then we've got to really think hard as to whether or not this property has any chance whatsoever in being successful. Now, granted, you can adjust a good number of these assumptions, you know, and to a certain extent to try to see if there's a little bit of wiggle room in terms of getting the property to go from potentially not being, you know, a project that you would move forward with to one that is. But you'd be very careful about that as, you know, a developer from the standpoint, you don't want to overestimate your revenues. You don't want to underestimate your expenses. Okay? I mean, it's very basic math in the sense of just kind of understanding that. The tendency, on the other hand, by a lot of developers is to do what? Be very pompous and arrogant and very kind of, you know, thinking that they can get any rent that they possibly could get, you know, on a particular property, and don't really want to pay attention to what the market dynamics are actually telling them. Okay, so this is meant to be very much of a, you know, kind of a very objective way of being able to kind of analyze a property. Okay, is that right? That makes sense to everybody? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, the flip side to the front door approach is the back door approach. Okay, now with the back door approach, you start with knowing what your total square footage of the building is going to be that you want to either build or acquire, what your rents that you're going to be able to charge, okay, based on what you have determined from the market and based on this property, or maybe even the historical information from this property if it's an existing property. And then you're going to kind of just go down the income statement in terms of the income and so forth, and then you're going to basically say, okay, well, this is the kind of loan I can get on this property and so forth, so on. And what this model is going to spit out is basically how much you could actually spend on the property in terms of what dollar amount you could spend in terms of an acquisition price for the property if it's already built. And then if it's not already built, then you would subtract out, you know, effectively what your estimated construction costs are to tell you what the maximum amount you could spend on the land would be. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's just two different ways of kind of approaching the problem. Okay, that's the reason why it's called front door and back door, is just simply two different mechanisms of kind of getting at kind of the same answer. Now, what you typically are going to do, you may use both approaches and just kind of, you know, see if you sort of need to kind of reconcile anything. But many of the variables on the two different approaches are the same. It's just a question of which direction you're sort of going with. Okay, make sense? Now the model, or the handout that I gave you, is just, I mean, there's nothing, you know, incredibly unique about this, but what I've tried to do is basically the model that on the top gives you a required rent per square foot of $17.49, okay, based upon all of those criteria that are listed there under the front door approach. So what I do then on the back door approach in this particular case is I sort of say, okay, let's sort of round that off to $17.50 and then kind of work back the other direction and see if everything matches up. And what you see is it matches up almost precisely. And the only reason it doesn't match up absolutely precisely is because of that minor rounding difference between the $17.49 and $17.50, because it's actually somewhere in between the two. So, but what you see is at the very bottom, the maximum amount you could spend on land under the backdoor approach would be $250,597, whereas on the front door approach, you're basically $250,000 even. Okay, so the only reason for that almost $600 difference is that rounding. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Okay, and then the bottom part of this model, which we may or may not get to today, and is the beginnings of a basic sort of pro forma, okay, in terms of just the year-to-year sort of before tax cash flow model that we would use with the same sort of data. But the primary goal for today is to get us through basically the front door and the back door approach, and that's obviously what the spreadsheet completion quiz will be based on, okay? So it's only going to be based on these first two, not on the bottom one, okay? All right. So, with that, any questions before we get started? Okay, so you should have the model pulled up. All right, now this model, I did it a little bit differently in one sense than kind of some of the previous models that we did. And the difference is here, the colored cells, the green cells on your screen are the actual input cells, not the formula cells. So it's just the opposite of the previous models. And the reason I did that was simply because for this particular model, it made a little bit more sense to do it that way, okay? So there's no absolute that you've got to do it one way or the other or have them colored at all. I just do that just for my own kind of keeping it straight in my head as to what is an input versus what is an actual calculation. So what we can do to begin with is for each of these input cells, we can go ahead and just start by putting in the information that I've provided you on the sheet. Oops, if I can type it myself. So 250,000, 750,000. We're going to leave everything else blank. We're just going to type in just the parts that are in green. There's a method to my madness on this, so just go ahead and right now don't do any of the others. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing for the backdoor approach. Just type in all the givens. Okay, so once we get all those typed in, okay, let's go back up to, once again, the top. All right. So what I would like for you to do is on your own, attempt to go ahead and fill in the remainder, okay? I mean, once again, most of them, the only one that you should have any difficulty with is the annualized mortgage constant. All the others are just adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing. So let's just see if you can go ahead and do the math to calculate the remaining cells. Bruce, is there a problem? You?
No, fuck it.
What?
I'm about to-
No. Once again, you're looking for the check figures. Obviously, you've got the sheet to be able to help you out. Okay. to help you out, I'll go ahead and show you the formula here for the annualized mortgage contract. We're going to go through it together, but I'm just going to pop it up there. So once again, that should be the only one you really get hung up on. All the others should be, once again, adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing.
Yes, I have that, but I have 0.08 something. I don't know why.
I'm sorry?
I have that same formula, but I came out with 0.08.
Did you multiply by 12?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, just out of curiosity, how many people have gotten at least all the way down to line 17? Anybody? Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Good. Okay, so let me go through and just kind of explain each piece as we sort of work down the model, all right? So it should be pretty straightforward. If you did everything correctly, you should get the 17.49. All right, now, let's just start off. Once again, I've already talked a little bit about the site acquisition cost. That, as I said, I would tend, as a potential investor, developer, would say the site acquisition cost would be any and all costs affiliated with basically buying the land, getting the land entitled, doing any sort of site preparation work in terms of putting in infrastructure, utilities, all of that sort of stuff. That's what I would consider site acquisition cost. Then construction cost, as I said, that would specifically be those costs affiliated with building the actual physical structure on the land. Now, if you buy a property, and once again, sometimes people will ask the question, well, what if I'm buying a property and it's not separated? In other words, I'm just buying a building that's already been built, then you could just skip over really the site construction cost and just put in the total amount as your construction cost, or just put in the total amount of your development cost as your whole acquisition. I mean, there's a variety of ways you could do that, or you could sort of say, all right, let me go to the county assessors and take a look at how they value the land, use that as maybe a basis for the land value, and then the remaining amount that you're going to put in on your purchase price would be affiliated with the construction cost, okay? Or potentially if you get the land valued by an appraiser and then try to separate out the value of the improvements, that would be yet another way. So the point is simply you've got to start off with your total investment value, whatever that is, okay? Land and improvements, okay? Is everybody cool with that? Any questions on that piece? Okay? Now, the next piece, as we're sort of working from there, is once we know what the acquisition price of the land is going to be, then we are going to go to a lender, all right? And we're going to say, all right, what kind of a loan is this lender willing to give us? And usually one of the first things that we start with the commercial lender is the loan to value ratio, all right? And most lenders, if you were to Google right now, commercial lenders, and you kind of start tooling around with kind of what the loan terms are going to be, you're probably going to see lenders be fairly explicit about what their loan terms are. You know, 60% loan to value ratio, 70% loan to value ratio, 80% loan to value ratio, depending on the property type, depending on the geographic location, depending on the quality, depending on a whole number of factors. But ultimately, that's a piece of information you need to be able to source, okay? Does that make sense? Okay? All right, so once you've got that loan to value ratio, then you're able to do the simple math of taking $1 million of the total development cost, multiplying it by the 80% loan to value ratio, and that's simply telling us that we've got a permanent mortgage amount of $800,000, okay? Which means, just to make sure you're paying attention to me, what does that mean our equity is?
20%?
20% or what dollar amount? 200,000. Okay, good. All right, now, this next piece for the permanent mortgage. We've got the two input variables of 5% interest rate, loan term of 15 years. Same sort of thing that I was talking about with the loan to value ratio, we're going to be doing with those two pieces of information. We're going to find a lender, we're going to find out what their standard normal terms are in terms of the interest rate, in terms of the loan term. Now the beautiful part, of course, about this model is we can constantly change it, you know, and instantly change it so that any of those, you know, things that we want to sort of take a look at, like for example, what if, let's just kind of use this as a what if scenario, that we go to a lender and we find another lender that says, we'll give you a 90% loan to value, but we're going to charge you a 7% interest rate for 30 years. Okay? Well, if that's the case, that changes our bottom line as to the rent level that we've actually got to achieve on the property in order for it to be feasible. Does that make sense? Okay? So that's one of the very valuable kind of pieces of analysis with this, is that it allows you to do that kind of sensitivity analysis to be able to get a sense for, you know, what are going to be the key influencers on the rental rates that you're going to need to achieve, or working it the other way, the key influencers on, you know, how much you can pay for a property. Okay, make sense? All right, so they put those values back to what they were so we don't confuse things. Okay. And then one other piece of information that we need to get from our lender is the debt coverage ratio. All right? And I believe we've talked about this, but if we haven't, let me go ahead and make sure that I talk about it. So the debt service coverage ratio, DSCR, also sometimes abbreviated just to DCR, debt coverage ratio, is equal to the net operating income, and this is annual net operating income that a property generates, divided by, in this case, the
Annual debt service?
the annual debt service. Brain just went blank. Okay, divided by the annual debt service, which is simply your principal and interest for the loan over the course of the year. So in this particular instance, and we're going to come back to the annualized mortgage constant here in just a second. So what we're saying is that we've got the cash required for the debt service, in this case of basically $75,916.19, and we know that our maximum debt service coverage ratio, or minimum debt service coverage ratio that our lender will allow is a 1.3. So that allows us to back into this annual net operating income, which in this case is the $98,691.04. Now, what does this number actually mean, the DSCR? It is, in essence, sort of the cushion that the lender requires in order for a loan to be made, all right? So, in essence, what the lender is saying that if you remember back to our sort of traditional kind of operating statement where we've got potential gross income, we subtract out, in this case, vacancies and collection losses, we add in other income, that gives us effective gross income, subtract out total operating expenses, which gives us net operating income, subtract out annual debt service, that gives us, in this case, before tax cash flow. All right? Well, the piece that we're actually focusing on with this is the net operating income, which is the $98,691.04, and then the lender, by virtue of what we have done above, has limited us to $75,916.19. And so once again, the relationship between these two is the debt service coverage ratio. Does that make sense? So the point is the lender is really concerned with, to a certain extent, what that number is, because they want to ensure that there's more than ample amount of money for them to be paid the amount that they're owed of the $75,000. Does that make sense? Okay, so just do a quick math. It'll be $22,774.85 would be our before tax cash flow. But the point is that for this annual debt service, the lender is basically saying, after you have paid all of your bills and you're left with this $98,000, but you've got to pay us the $75,000, but after that, you're still going to be left with hopefully sufficient, more than sufficient cash flows that in the event something up here hasn't worked out, there's enough money left over to pay us as the lender. That's the whole idea behind the debt service coverage ratio. Now, if we were to lower, let's just see what would happen. If we were to lower the debt service coverage ratio to just 1, okay? By doing that, that basically is saying we're going to allow you to have just enough income to pay us, okay? And if that's the case, there's not going to be any money left over. It's going to be 0 down here for before tax cash flow. Well, if you're the lender, would you want that to happen? No. Because you're going to be afraid that there's going to be a miscalculation of these expenses and not be enough money down there. Okay? So the higher that you raise the debt service coverage ratio above 1 just simply means that you are being more risk adverse as a lender, meaning that you want to simply ensure there's going to be adequate or more than adequate money for you to be paid. Okay? Yep.
So is that like kind of like saying the lender requires that you make a 30% profit in order for them to?
It's one way to look at it. I tend to sort of think of it as it's an income cushion. I don't like calling it profit because to me it is your before tax cash flow, yes. But that's not inherently profit, but it's just the lender's perspective, not the investor's perspective.
So revenue?
Well, yeah, to a certain extent it's revenue. Okay, somebody dropped.
Yeah, what's the lowest that you've ever seen this?
Talking about like for a just absolutely top shelf, class A, everything is wonderful, 1.1.
But what's the high? What's the spectrum that you've seen?
I've seen it as high as like 1.6, 1.7.
And is it dependent on property type or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
What about
I would say the normal, let's put it this way. For many years, the normal range was like between probably 1.2 to 1.3.
Okay.
And anytime you start to hit rough times in the economy, then it tends to go up a little bit more to like 1.4, you know, in some cases 1.5 in really horrible situations. Dustin, would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, that's about right.
Okay, so, all right, so let's put it back here, but take a look at what it's, just that one variable change though, and what impact that has on the rent required per square foot. So if the lender's really, obviously, very comfortable with you not having any extra cash laying around, that means that you could have actually had a much lower rental rate on your property, because you don't have to have as much money laying around to basically keep them happy. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's go back for a second. Let me go ahead and put that back to 1.3. Since I skipped over the annualized mortgage constant here for a second. Okay. All right. So any questions up to this point? Yep.
All right, so what about the experience of the investor? So there's no way for, like, let's say an investor to come in and kind of negotiate?
No, it's possible. I mean, you know, once again, every lender is different,
Right.
but most of them tend to have fairly standard, structured kind of loan programs available. I mean, even on the construction side, I mean, even though that there can be a lot of variation, there's usually, as a matter of standard practice, there's going to be some fairly consistent standards that lender's going to apply. So whenever, because what happens as a matter of course is that with virtually any loan, you know, whether it's a development loan, construction loan, it's going to go to a bank and it's going to go through basically a loan committee. Okay, that loan committee made up of different, you know, bank officers. They're going to, you know, be given the documentation regarding this loan and all the backup material, and they're going to sit around and they're, to a certain extent, going to make a decision. You know, number one, should we make this loan, yes or no? But also, you know, what sort of conditions, you know, or provisions are we going to require, even maybe above and beyond these sort of stated criteria? And they're going to take into account things like, okay, well, you know, how many other projects has this particular person done within this particular community? How successful have they been? Have they ever defaulted? You know, what do we think, you know, that the outlook is for this particular product type? Yada, yada, yada. So it's one of those things that it's, well, it's not absolute, but even without it being absolute, there's still going to be what I would call an operational sort of range of where those numbers are going to be. But in other words, you're never going to have it way up here, you're never going to have it way down here. It's going to be somewhere in that range, but that's part of the stress test that you know, would put on the model. And whenever they come back to you, like as an example, they come back to you, this is your estimate, okay? You take it to them, and they come back to you and they say, there's no way we're going to accept a 1.3, we demand a 1.4, okay, for the debt coverage ratio. There's no way that we're going to accept a 5% interest rate and we're going to demand a 7% interest rate. There's no way we're going to do a 15-year term, we're going to do a 10-year term. Well, you adjust the model.
Right.
And then, based on that, what's going to tell you? You know, whether or not the project is more feasible or less feasible. Okay? All right. So once again, going back to the mortgage constant here for a second. Okay. As I told the real estate finance class this morning with respect to this, and we're going to kind of repeat so they get to hear it the second time, about mortgage constants. Okay. Stop. Okay. Mortgage constants. The way that I explained it this morning, and I'll explain the same thing this afternoon, is many years ago, a lot of textbooks included all these tables at the end of the books, specifically these present value tables, future value tables, and present value and annuity tables, and also mortgage constant tables. And the purpose of these tables was kind of predating the traditional financial calculator. They had already calculated the values for a number of these sort of financial calculations, so that all you would have to do is know the loan amount, multiply it by the mortgage constant to be able to get your monthly payment or annual payment. And the point is that the mortgage constants are going to be based on whatever the interest rate is and the term. Okay? And so what you're doing in terms of, if we want to look at it from the kind of the perspective of the calculator here for a second, you're going to be putting in, let's say 12 payments per year, and you're going to put in an interest rate, in this case, let's say a 5%, a term of 15 years, and then you're going to put $1 as your loan amount or your present value. And then you're going to solve for what is the payment. Now the payment that you get here is going to be your monthly mortgage constant, which then you're going to need to multiply by 12 in order to get our annual mortgage constant. All right, so let's just do this first piece. Okay, so the monthly mortgage constant is going to be negative 0.079079336 and some change, okay? We just need to multiply that by 12. That gives us 0.09489523552. Okay? Now, and this is the annualized mortgage constant compounded monthly. All right? Now, that number should match up with what we have up here on the screen in terms of the calculation that Excel did for us, in terms of this number right here. Now, what we can do with that number, and this is the part kind of where the application aspect of this sort of comes into play, is that we can take this number, the annual mortgage constant, and multiply it by our loan amount, and that is going to give us our total loan payment, in this case, our annual loan payment for the mortgage. So the beautiful part with this mortgage constant is we can put in this 0.094895 and change, and then we can pick any loan amount, $1, $100,000, whatever, and that will instantly give us what our loan amount is. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, why would we care about even calculating this annualized mortgage constant if we have a financial calculator and we've got Excel? There it is. Well, in one sense, you don't have to. But there is an interesting aspect to it. Because what this is actually telling you, and this is the part where hopefully the headlights begin to sort of come on, this number is really the percent of the loan amount that you're paying each year. There's another way to look at it. So if you've got a $100,000 loan, you're actually paying 9.48% of that each year. Now, make sure that I'm very clear about what I just said. That is the amount that you are paying each year. That is not the amount you are paying off each year. Okay? Now, the difference is, this is your payment. Okay? In other words, the amount you're paying in terms of your payment. It is not the amount of principal that's being repaid. It's not, the amount of interest. It's the combined principal and interest that you're paying each year. So another way of kind of looking at this, you obviously want to minimize your annualized mortgage constant. And so through the combination of saying, okay, what's the lowest interest rate that I can get? Okay, well, let me ask you, before I just say what I'm about to say, you've got two variables that comprise the mortgage constant, the interest rate and the term. Okay? If I wanted to get the lowest possible mortgage constant what would I do about these two variables? In other words, which one would be high, which one would be low? Or would both be high, would both be low?
High term, low interest.
Okay, you would get a high term or long term, and you would get a low interest rate. Okay, that's going to give you the lowest overall mortgage constant, or lowest overall cost of borrowing.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Okay, now, one of the interesting little nifty things that I had forgotten I'd actually embedded in this was if you go down here to the bottom and you click on sheet 1. This is a mortgage constant table. Okay, now you can't really read them all on my screen, but you should be able to read them on your screen. But what we've got over here on the left column, or the left row, the left column was right, are interest rates ranging from 1% all the way down to, I don't know what the highest one was, 12%?
Yeah.
Okay, and then up here, obviously, running across the top, you've got terms ranging from 5-year terms all the way to 30-year terms. And then what you can see is, in essence, just what I pretty much described. The lowest overall cost of borrowing is a 30-year term with a 1% interest rate. And then everything else just kind of grows significantly, obviously, as you go kind of down and to the left. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So the beautiful part about this table is instantly we could go up there and say, okay, for a 15-year loan with a 7% interest rate, 15-year loan, 7% interest rate would be a mortgage constant of 0.10785939925. Okay, and then we could take that number, replace what's here, multiply by a loan amount, and then instantly calculate a monthly or an annual payment. Does it make sense? Yes? Okay. Okay, so that gets us down, if we will, to, we talked about the debt coverage ratio, we got to the NOI. All right, so this next little piece. Now this is the part, or this part of the model that is going to make the least amount of sense to many of you. And because it's backward logic, okay? And you'll see what I'm saying here in just a second. Once you understand the backward logic, then it all makes sense. It's very straightforward. Okay? Now, what do I mean by the backward logic? Well, if you remember what I was saying earlier, you know, a normal pro forma, potential gross income minus vacancies and collection losses plus other income gives us effective gross income, subtract out total operating expenses, gives us net operating income, subtract out annual debt service, gives us before tax cash flow, and so forth, so on. Okay? Well, we have gotten kind of to this point right here where we've got, in this case, our net operating income, we said, of $98,691.04. And we also have our debt service coverage, or our debt service, of $75,916. Okay, and then we can go ahead and calculate our before tax cash flow. Don't really have to. We've already done this before, but I'm going to do it again. Okay, double check. 22,774.85.
Yep.
Okay, all right. So what I'm talking about with the backward logic is this. Okay, so we have been working kind of from this direction, moving up the income statement, okay, instead of going down the income statement. So in this case, we are now being told, the next piece of information that we're being told is, what is the estimated operating expenses not passed through to the tenants? $50,000. That's this number right here. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Well, what are we solving for after we do that?
PDI.
we're basically just going up kind of the food chain. You see? Required effective gross income. So what we're saying is we're adding this to get this. Okay? I mean, obviously reverse, because it's not going to be this minus this to get this. It's going to be this plus this to get this. Does that make sense? Once again, the reverse logic I'm talking about. Okay? So that gives us 148, 691.04. Okay? Going up. All right? Now then, we don't have anything for other income. I left that as 0 and didn't even put it into the model because it really didn't need to. But what I did put in there was, okay, what about our vacancies and collection law? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going back to the estimated operating expense.
Yep.
Is that just essentially expenses that you don't put into your rent, that you don't charge your tenants rent for? And then what, is there like a traditional cost, or is that just the landlord's?
It's up to the property owner as to a certain extent, what they're going to pass through the tenants and what they are going to be responsible for. And this gets into the whole discussion of basically gross leases versus net leases. And we'll do a quick little primer on that. So basically, at one end of the spectrum, we have gross leases. Okay. Which is what I would tend to term, it's an all bills paid situation for the tenant. All bills paid, I'm going to put by landlord for tenant. Okay? Over here, on the other end of the extreme, I would have what I would call an absolute, oops, spell. Try again, okay. Triple net lease, okay? This is simply where the tenant pays every bill on property for owner or landlord. And I think we've already talked about this a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, and so the point with the model here is we're saying that $50,000, so we don't have a situation of where it is, you know, if the landlord is having to actually pay $50,000, then that means that it's definitely not an absolute triple net. Okay, it means it's somewhere beyond a triple net, maybe not a gross, but somewhere kind of in this middle ground of basically, you know, some form of a net lease, or it could be a gross lease, you know, for that matter. We're not really defining what it is with that $50,000. It's just simply that is an expense that is being borne by the property owner and not passed through to the tenants. So they're not being reimbursed for it, is what I'm trying to say. And so this could very well be a situation of where the property owner has simply said, you're going to pay me a monthly rent, but I'm going to take care of paying the property taxes on the building, I'm going to take care of paying the insurance on the building, I'm going to take care of all maintenance and repairs on the building, but you're still going to take care of the utility.
Would like a side effect of, I guess, of absolute triple net lease be that like the tenant doesn't take care of the property as well?
No,
as they should?
not necessarily. There's usually going to be a maintenance agreement contract of some sort that's going to specify, you know, what their responsibilities are, you know, in terms of routine maintenance, or there may very well be a third party that provides all those services to the site that the tenant just has to pay for.
I was just thinking, like, say the lease is up in a month and like a pipe sleep.
Let me make sure that I'm clear though. On an absolute triple net lease, most of these properties, what we're talking about Class A, not necessarily Class A, but we're talking about very high quality tenants in the sense that a lot of like big box stores, retailers that like a Walgreens or a CVS or something like that,
Okay.
that they're basically, and this is a whole other discussion, but they're basically buying the site, developing the site, getting it occupied with their business, and then selling it off to a third-party investor that accepts this absolute triple net lease that they simply make cash flow payments to for the next 25, 30 years.
And I guess it's not common among residential properties? Because that's just sort of where my.
I wouldn't think so.
Okay.
I mean, you could, I suppose, I don't know. It's all a question of how far can you go as the property owner to shift as many costs onto the tenant as possible. Yeah, is ideal from the property owner's perspective.
Yeah.
You know, from the tenant's perspective, just the opposite. You know, how many responsibilities can you shift to the owner? And so there is a negotiation there that's going to be able to take place between an owner and a tenant as to who's responsible for what. And, you know, my suspicion, or not suspicion, but, you know, the reality is that if you look at retail leases, like whether it's in a mall or a, you know, a small neighborhood shopping center, that probably no two of those leases are going to be absolutely identical. Yeah. Each one's going to have some minor variations, in some cases major variations, because maybe a national tenant, they're able to come in with a lot of power and authority and pretty much dictate what they're going to do to the owner of the property. And then you're going to have the local mom and pop tenants that, you know, are just kind of at the whim of whatever that property owner chooses to do. I mean, would you describe it any different?
No, I agree. I just add on some of the Walgreens, a lot of times they'll just pay the real estate taxes directly, so the landlord doesn't have to go through the problem of remembering to pay at the end of the year or whatever. Yeah. And then by different product type, you have different customary spread of those expenses. You know, and a Class A office tower is usually a full service gross lease. That will include everything. But a smaller office building, we have package units and the AC, the tenant might be responsible for AC maintenance.
So you're able to shift, like, the, I guess, burden or the responsibility of taxes to the tenant instead of the owner?
Yeah. I mean, and see, that's another interesting component of this. And that is, sometimes it's not intuitively obvious to the casual observer, and I like that term, intuitively obvious to the casual observer, what the real cost of occupancy is on a property from just looking at an informational flyer put out by a property owner or management firm. Because what I mean by that is, what if you have a building, whether it's a, you know, this is like a shopping center as an example. A lot of the inline stores, you know, as just saying, you know, are maybe going to have their own individual air conditioning units, you know, package units that are going to just serve just their store. Okay, so they're probably going to pay their own utility bill in most cases. But what if, whenever the developer was developing that they chose to put the most energy inefficient air conditioning imaginable in the property? They did an absolutely horrific job with the insulating of the property. They did a horrible job in terms of the glazing on the windows for the store that let in every possible heat, you know, gain kind of thing imaginable. So they almost created a pressure cooker environment that has to have the air conditioning running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to try to get it to cool down. Okay, so they've got a massive cost for their, you know, electric bill every single month because of that situation. Versus some developer across the street developed almost an identical shopping center, but put extremely energy efficient air conditioning, extremely effective glazing on the outside of the building, great, you know, insulation, you know, so their electric bill is maybe 20% of what this guy's electric bill is. Well, the true cost of occupancy needs to include that.
Yeah.
And so, but this guy over here that has the really energy inefficient building, he may be charging a lower stated rental rate because he didn't have very high development cost to actually basically have a crappy building, versus the one over here is charging a higher lease rate. But part of the reason he should be able to capture that higher lease rate is because your energy costs are going to be a lot less. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, that's just one kind of, I'm trying to make an extreme example so that, you know, hopefully sinks in.
Right.
But the general idea is just simply that the true cost of occupancy on a per square foot basis is sometimes a very difficult number to get at, especially prior to the lease actually taking place. Now, you've got historical, operating information, for the property that they're willing to turn over prior to you signing the lease, or they're willing to, once again, allow you to put the burden on them, then that, something that kind of be dealt with. But my point is that no two properties are identical whenever it comes to those true cost of occupancy. Anything you want to add to that? Okay.
Little question, I might be getting into too much detail here, but in a scenario where like the tenant assumes responsibility for the taxes and whatnot, are they liable for not paying your taxes?
Yes. Yeah. Well, indirectly. The owner of the property is still going to be held liable,
Right.
but the tenant would be held liable to the owner.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay?
We owe the government.
Ultimately, the government's going to get their money,
Yeah.
and they're going to come to you as the owner of the property first.
Right.
And then you're going to say, well, my tenant didn't pay me, and they're going to say, well, we don't care. But the end game is the tenant's going to have to pay you as the property owner in order to pay off the property taxes.
So is it riskier?
It's,
Depends on the credit of the tenant.
yeah.
And it also increases the value of a single tenant, triple net lease as an investment, because the guys that buy that kind of stuff just want to put the money to bed and not think about it.
Right.
And they'll have to remember to pay on all 50 properties they own across the country.
Precisely.
The different municipalities and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a whole thing of, you're trying to solve problems for different people. In the sense of what he's saying, you're trying to make it easier for maybe the owners because they don't want to have to think about it. They don't want to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and say, oh, did I pay the property taxes this year? Or, oh, did I pay the, utility bill this month? Or, oh, did I, do any of that? You're just sort of able to kind of deflect that, onto the tenant. But hopefully there's some sort of a check and balance system in place that you're going to know if they didn't pay it.
Yeah.
Because that would be the worst case scenario kind of thing, is that they didn't pay it, you didn't know about it, and then all of a sudden you've got a tax lien foreclosure that begins to happen on your property because, they didn't pay the bill, and you've got penalties and assessments that are going to come due as a result of that.
Okay. Would you pay your taxes at different times depending on where you are? I've never had a house.
I guess every jurisdiction's a little bit different. All the property I own is in Texas, and I just know from my own personal experience that all property taxes in Texas, if you make a payment, you can make a half payment at the end of November for the prior year, and then you make the other half in like June. Or you have to pay all of it by the end of January. So it's kind of, that's how their system is set up.
Yeah.
Here, I'm not 100% sure.
I think November is just the
You
kind
get
of
discount
standard.
if you do it by November.
Okay, well, that's basically the same sort of thing. Okay, or, when's the final payment due? Is it due January 31st?
March, yeah.
March, okay. Okay, moving forward. Or back. All right, so now, what we've got after this, we've got the 148, 691. We don't have any other income that we've put into this model, all right? But what we do have is an occupancy rate for basically this model to be able to calculate our potential gross income. We don't need, in the model itself, to actually calculate the line item here for the vacancy and collection loss. All we really need to do, or all we really do in the model, is we simply take the 148,691 and we divide that by the expected occupancy rate of the 0.85, and then the resulting answer from that is our potential gross income. Does that make sense? Okay, it's simple math, all right? So basically, to prove the math, I'll show you. So 148, 691, 04 divided by 0.85 gives us 174, 930, 64, okay? Now, if we wanted to find out what the actual vacancy and collection loss was, we can approach it, one of a couple of ways. One, we can just simply take this minus this, and that's going to give us that. Or we can just simply take this times
1 minus, or
0.15, because the vacancy and collection loss is basically 15%, the occupancy is 85%, so it's just obviously 1 minus the occupancy rate. And so we should get 26,239, 5960, and then that, once again, if we subtract that out, that should give us this. Okay, make sense? Yep. Okay. Now, so that gets us to our required gross revenue of the 174, 930, 64. Okay, so from here, all we're doing is we're simply saying, what is the amount of leasable square feet that we have in our property? And that is, you know, once again, just what is the actual physical space? Now, this is an interesting point of discussion. In this case, we're calling it leasable square feet. We can also, there are a lot of different little terms here that we could use. We could use gross building area. That's not the same as leasable square feet, okay? Gross building area, kind of walk you through this a little bit. I don't want to get too hung up on this, but I just want to sort of illustrate my point. So let's just say that we've got a building and the interior space of this building from inside wall to inside wall with no partitions whatsoever is pretty much, I guess, 100 feet by 100 feet, okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Interior wall to interior wall, okay? So I'm measuring from here to there, and there to there, okay? So 100 feet in both directions. Now, that would mean 100 times 100 should be 10,000, this little box with a line through it, square feet. 10,000 square feet for the building. And I would consider that to be leasable square feet. Does everybody understand? Now, we're going to do a couple of different little things. One is the gross building area might be a little bit more than that because walls aren't necessarily paper thin. Okay, like take for example, you know, these walls. Okay, if we actually go from the wall, from this part, all the way out to the exterior cladding on the outside of the building, it's at least 1 foot thick. Okay. Now that's not going to make a huge difference with this particular building, but some buildings it would. So that really means what? That from here, kind of to here, in terms of the outer wall, okay, that really means you've got an extra foot over here, and you've got an extra foot over here, yes? So it's really 102 feet. Does everybody see that? Same thing, up here and up here, 102 feet. All right? Now, if we take 102 times 102, it's not a huge difference. But it does add an extra 404 square feet onto the building. Well, that's an extra 404 square, you know what I'm trying to say. An extra 404 square feet of rent that we're going to have to pay. Okay? Well, if our rent, in this case, is $17.49, so that just the 404 by itself, that's going to be an extra $7,000 a year. Okay, you follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So, and that's just the rental piece, okay? So that's not an insignificant factor to just automatically dismiss, you know, and not really, you know, take into consideration. Now, this was a super, super, super simple example, okay? Never is it this simple, okay? Because look at this room. Calculate the square footage of this room. You've got all sorts of these indentions and everything else, you know, so that if you were really calculating the precise dimensions of this room, you've got all sorts of geometry you're going to have to figure out if you're really going to be accurate, okay? Not saying that, you know, every single building is going to go to that level of complication. That, you know, most instances, you're probably going to have them going, yeah, okay, that wall to that wall, this wall to that wall, but it's not going to be precise. You follow what I'm saying? Okay? But yet, that's not really even the most complicated part. With a lot of buildings, you're not charging the tenants, in some cases, for common areas, like hallways, elevators, staircases. And every building is a little bit different. In some buildings, you do charge them a common area sort of fee based upon maybe how much they're renting, you know, how many square feet they're renting. But in other cases, you don't. But that's going to have to be reflected, is my point. That's the reason I'm trying to go through this in terms of you thinking about it. That's going to have to be reflected in trying to get an accurate number for what is the actual leasable, chargeable square footage for the property. Does that make sense? Because, like, for example, you go to lease an apartment. This is probably a better example. You go to lease an apartment, are you paying for the common spaces? No, at least not in your base rent. They're charging you rent based upon the confines of your apartment, and usually they will also include your balconies as square footage, okay? You may not pay attention to it, but if you've got a really big balcony in your place, I would be not surprised if that's not included automatically as part of the square footage calculation for your apartment whenever they go to calculate the per square foot charge. My point being is, well, yeah, it's usable space. It's not air-conditioned space, but it's usable space, okay? So I'm not saying it shouldn't be included, but the point is you've got to ensure that you're trying to be accurate about this. Okay. So all of that, once we get to that $174,930.64, we simply divide that by the 10,000 square feet, and that gives us this required rent per square foot of $17.49. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about this model, this part of the model? Does that seem pretty straightforward to you? Yes or no? Okay. Is there any part about it that just doesn't make sense logically?
Just a question.
Yep.
You were talking about it gets detailed in like the square footage. Is it dependent on like the product type?
Sure.
So which is the most detailed? Which one?
Well, if I had to overgeneralize,
right,
I would say the most difficult or challenging is probably going to be with office buildings, and I would say probably the least difficult is probably going to be industrial space. That would be my gross overgeneralization. Dustin, what do you think?
Great. Yeah, office gets pretty complicated. There's like 3 numbers really that you look at: gross building area, which you talked about. There's leasable or rentable square footage, and then there's the actual usable square footage. So usable is like the interior of this room. But leasable or rentable might include what you're talking about, common areas like hallways, corridors, bathrooms, or shared, but it doesn't include vertical penetrations like elevators or stairwells. Okay. So, and the typical loss factor or add-on factor, which is the difference between usable and rentable for office, is about 15% for suburban office, but if you get into like downtown buildings, it can be as high as 20–25%. And a lot of times tenants don't even know they're really paying on that. And that's when you're doing a tour and you walk through a space and they go, this room, you know, doesn't add up to what's quoted on the flyer. And then that's when you have to explain to them they're paying an extra 20% in rent to use the hallway or the, you know, lobby to the building or whatever.
Yep. Okay. Makes sense? Okay. All right, so let's move forward with the flip side of the model. Okay. Okay, so the backdoor approach. Okay? So here, I want you to do the same thing you did on the top half of the model. See if you can do all the calculations yourself to get down to the maximum supportable site acquisition cost. Okay, once again, just adding and subtracting for the most part, and dividing.
Professor, do we input the implied going in cap? And
Not yet. Okay.
I didn't know.
vacancy rate. Oh, I'm so sorry, I got it on. Are you gonna do this? Over here, just hogging your paper.
Okay, everybody got it filled in? Oops. Okay, so let's go down through this. Let's kind of reverse our logic train. So here, we're starting out with the 10,000 square feet. All right. So we've got our 10,000 square feet. We know that our rent rate is $17.50 per square foot. So we just do the basic math of getting our 175,000, which is going to be our potential gross income. All right. So once again, we sort of start off over here, potential gross income. We've got our vacancies and collection losses. In this case, once again, we're told that we have an occupancy rate of 85%. So all we really have to do is to multiply this times 0.15, which is simply 1 minus 0.85, okay, to give us the 1.5, and then that's going to give us $26,250 as our vacancy and collection loss. Then we're going to add in our other income of 0, which now that's, do the math on that, should give us $148,750 as our effective gross income. All right, so that gets us down to basically there. So you're saying all we're doing is just flipping everything. Okay, makes sense? But this one is a little bit easier to do, kind of conceptually, at least I think so, because you're working kind of from the top down, okay, in terms of the logic piece and doing the calculations. All right, especially when you're doing them by hand. Okay, now, the next piece, we subtract out total operating expenses, which we put 50,000 there. All right, which then leaves us with our NOI. Of the 98,750. Okay? So everybody's got down to that point, yes?
Yeah.
All right. Then we've got some of our loan information here, debt service coverage ratio, interest rate, and term. So the next piece that we've got to calculate, which is an identical situation as what we did above. We're just calculating our mortgage constant. So equal, negative payment, open parentheses, C29 divided by 12, comma, D29 divided by 12, comma, 1 for our present value, comma, times 12, and that gives us our annual mortgage constant compounded monthly. Okay, everybody matching up?
Move that back real quick.
You do, but yeah.
Good. All right. Okay, now, so at this point, okay, what we are doing, this is the one part of this that if there is one part that's a little screwy in terms of the math, take a look at what you're actually doing. You're taking your expected net operating income, you're dividing it by your debt service coverage ratio, you're dividing it by your annualized mortgage constant, you're dividing it by your maximum loan to value ratio, doing all three of those in sequence then gives you the maximum supportable project cost, okay? Now, it's kind of a shortcut to the math, but let's just sort of take a look, okay? So let's just, if you're putting it into the calculator, as an example, or into the spreadsheet, you're simply taking the 98,750 and you are dividing it by the debt service coverage ratio of 1.3. You are dividing that by the mortgage constant, the annualized mortgage constant of the 0.094895 and some change, and then you're taking that and you're dividing it by the maximum loan to value ratio of 80%, and then that is going to give us the maximum supportable project cost. Okay? All right, so let's just plug those in to see if they at least, it's going to be a little bit off because of rounding, but I just want to kind of illustrate that yes, it is, that is the math. 98,750 divided by 1.3 divided by 0.094895 and divided by 0.8. And once again, due to rounding, it's going to be a little bit off, but it's basically 1,599,085, and up here 1,597,000. So a difference of about basically a little over $1 and something, but only due to the rounding because I rounded off the annualized mortgage constant. Okay, make sense? Okay, now. Okay, so let's just kind of continue on with the logic on this. All right, I think we've explained the logic, I think, pretty well about the debt service coverage ratio, about the annualized mortgage constant, and the loan to value ratio. And so, once again, we get down to this number, the $1 million. So once again, the $1 million with some change, that represents the total amount that we could spend on this property, including land and construction costs. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? And then, so from that, we are then subtracting out the construction cost of whatever those have been estimated to be. And now we could, you know, kind of change things up a little bit, but let's just do one little quick calculation. What's our construction cost per square foot? Well, it's, without really doing a whole lot of, without even punching it on the calculator, you get pretty darn close just by looking at it. Construction cost per square foot of the building.
75.
Basically $75 a square foot with some change, okay? Let's do the actual math. So equal, and then taking the construction cost divided by, in this case, we're sort of cheating because we're going with the leasable square feet and then not the gross building area. But once again, as I've said at the very beginning of all of this is a rough approximation, okay? The purpose of this model is just to give us a rough guide of what we can potentially spend on construction costs. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
75, is that a good number? Or
Once again, totally, completely depends on the product, totally, completely depends on the market. Because, like, for example, you know, if you take a state like New York, or take, you know, states that have high cost of labor due to labor unions, okay? Your labor costs are going to be through the roof. Compared to states like Texas, where labor costs are going to be dirt cheap, okay? Then you've got the other countervailing factor, land cost, okay? You take something like Florida, relatively high per square foot land cost, even higher, obviously, in New York, but once again, dirt cheap in Texas, you know, in most places. You know, so your overall construction cost, you know, is going to vary dramatically just depending on what part of the country or part of the world you're in, for that matter. Now, what I would use is something like RS means there used to be, sometimes they keep fooling around with this and what is free and what is not, but if you type in RS means, and you do like maybe a free cost estimator, let's see if that one works. That's not going to be the one that's wrong to look for. This is still not the version I'm looking for. But let's just sort of take a look. I mean, this has some localized cost per square foot for different building types, and you can sort of see, okay, the average cost, at least in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, about $245 a square foot, whereas in California, sort of Central California, $369 a square foot, and then you go up to, let's say, kind of New York and obviously the Northeast, $391 a square foot. So to answer your question is, yes, it varies, okay? But what I'm looking for, and like I said, they used to have a really cool little thing, and I haven't used it in a while, but RS Means had this super easy to use per square foot kind of building cost calculator, and they may or may not have taken it off of their
I think you got rid of it.
there was I think the free child thing. Yeah. Well, anyway.
What's the next best source? Yeah.
Well, there's also let's see, Dodge reports. There's
Call your local contractor.
Right.
yeah.
That's best.
I don't want to spend too much time looking for this, but I thought if somebody can find it, great. But what it would allow you to do, if you can find one, I'm sure there's one out there, but it will just allow you to type in your product type, type in your zip code, and then we'll give you kind of a range of what the construction cost would be for that particular area. That's really all you're really searching for, okay? So whatever source that you potentially could use for that, but at least gives you a ballpark idea. Okay, getting back to our model. Okay, now, let's do this. All right, you've done everything you need to do for the quiz.
Professor, you didn't do the implied going in.
I know.
Oh, that's why.
That's what I was just about to say.
That's why.
Okay, so basically, as I just said, we've done everything you need to do for the quiz for today, off of the spreadsheet. Now what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little time kind of finishing out the spreadsheet with some of the other calculations that we can do to actually begin to do some return calculations and begin to make it a little bit more complex than what just the basic financial feasibility model is. So here's what I want you to do. Okay, and some of these, I mean, all of these are not filled in for you. I'm going to try to blow this up a little bit for you. We're going to focus on these first couple of years. All right. Now, let's just go down to this bottom piece and potential gross income. Now, all of this, in terms of all of this stuff, that's just this. Okay? See it? Potential gross income, vacancy, collection losses, so forth, so on. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
All right? Now, in this particular model, we actually did insert some other income, and we'll talk about that and explain that here in a second. But what I've done with this sort of extension of the model is basically to say, all right, let's make it a bit more realistic. And let's also, instead of it being kind of a static situation of a one-year kind of snapshot of performance, let's make some assumptions about growth rates of income, growth rates of operating expenses, and so forth, so on, so that we can actually calculate a 5-year sort of projection for the property to then be able to say, okay, well, what if we sell it and we get the cash flows from that, and what is that going to relate to in terms of an overall return? Does that make sense? Yes? Okay, once again, this is not contained on the quiz. We're going to be doing this part right now, but in about 2 weeks, we're actually going to do a much more extensive version of this. So getting basically the understanding of this now would be very helpful. So it's not like you're going to be able to escape this, is what I'm trying to say. Okay? All right. Now, let's start with just these first couple of years. Okay? Kind of zoom in on those. All right, go ahead and populate these the colored cells with the growth rate of 3%. I'm going to explain it, but 3%, the 4%, the 6%, and the 4%. Okay? Everything else is blacked out on purpose because you're not going to be doing anything with those. Okay? And then you can also go ahead and populate the 25,000 for the other income cell. Okay, so those are all inputs. Everything else is basically a formula-driven thing. All right, so let's just, first of all, talk about potential gross income and then the growth rate. Okay, so we've got 175,000 up there as our potential gross income. But to the left of it, we have assigned a growth rate of 3%. What does that mean? That means that each year we want to sort of grow that revenue. We want to grow basically our rental rate by 3% a year. Now that may be overly optimistic, it may not be. But the point being is that's what we're sort of making the assumption. Now it may just, but here's another piece of that. We can also, as we can talk about, within commercial leases, you can have what are called escalation clauses, okay? Which in essence means that the rent will go up, maybe by a certain percent each year, or by a certain dollar amount each year. And it could be just stated explicitly within the lease, but it can also be tied to some sort of an outside index that potentially would allow the rent rate to go up, or in some cases down, mostly never down. But in this case, we're just simply saying it's going to grow by 3%. Is everybody cool with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, to get to the second column, to year 2, the math is basically to do what? To take the first column, multiply it by 1 plus the growth rate. So you can just do 1 in terms of Excel, 1 plus the growth rate of 0.03, and that's going to get you to the next column. But in this case, we want to obviously cell reference that. Okay, we don't necessarily want to just type it in hard-coded. So see if you can do that real quick. See if you can match up with year 2 for the potential gross income by cell referencing. Don't hard-code it. So in other words, what I'm asking you to calculate is year 2, the 180, 250. Okay. Now, I'll show you specifically what I did in terms of the way that I referenced it. So within cell B36, I did equal C36, which is obviously the 175,000, times 1 plus B36. Is that what you did?
Yeah.
Why did you put
put plus? Though?
I didn't really have to. I think
He's trying to
because it's already a positive.
He's trying to trick us.
It was probably just me being overly cautious.
Where is the vacancy rate for?
What?
What's the vacancy rate in general for year 1, or is that just something we put in?
Well, no, it's being drawn from above.
Okay.
See, that's the thing. Okay,
So
let me
you-
make sure, okay, that is clear as well. I forgot about that, my bad. So year one, you're stealing that number
From
from B23,
Okay,
okay? Because you're just pulling it down from your model.
right, right.
Okay?
Use the static, doesn't be
Well, for, probably not, well, because we're not gonna be copying it down quite that way. I mean, well, when we copy over, yes, we're gonna have to, deal with it differently. But I know where you're going. I'm gonna get there. Okay, so let's just do this, just to make sure that, let's just start with this column specifically. All right, so for cell C36, you're stealing that from cell B23.
Okay.
Okay, is everybody cool with that? That's just above in your model. Okay, let's just go down the page. Okay, for your vacancy and collection losses,
Okay, yeah, that's what I did.
what I did was tell the cell C36, which is right above that, and then multiply it by 1 minus, basically, the B24, which is going to be your occupancy rate. Okay? And sometimes, once again, there's more than one way to sometimes get at that same number, okay? You may have chosen to get at it a little bit differently, that's okay. As long as you get the same answer, okay? All right. Moving down the page, okay, the 25,000, obviously that's a hard-coded number. Okay, moving on down. Okay, so for, in this case, the effective gross income, you can see what we did, just simply the 175 minus the 26,250 plus the C38, or the 25,000. Right, see that? Once again, all we're doing is just following the very simple math over here on the far left. Okay?
Shit.
All right, now, right below that, the 50,000, that's just being drawn from above, from cell B26. Okay? And then the next line, did as a calculation. So C39 minus C40. So the effective gross income minus the total operating expenses gives us our net operating income. And once again, you could have drawn that from above. However, you have to be careful about that, because as we copy over across the page, we may have some issues there, okay? All right? And then the annual debt service, that's simply, what I did was take B27 divided by B28. Again, more than one way to get there as well. Okay, and then lastly, at least for this column, the before tax cash flow, C41 minus 42. All right, okay, now, let's see if we can deal with the kind of copying over across the page and see what we've got to do to be able to kind of accomplish that. So let's go back up here to year 2 in terms of the potential gross income. So we got the 180, 250. Now, what I did, it looks like, is I think I potentially maybe even sort of hard-coded the B36 without even trying to copy it over, and I just probably retyped it again. But you can just sort of see that each year, as you sort of go over, you're simply taking the previous year times 1 plus the growth rate. Does everybody see that?
Should we make B36 static?
You could. That's actually what Kenneth's question was earlier.
Okay.
And I wasn't 100% sure how I'd set this one up. And in this case, I did not do that. I just actually just did each one of them by hand,
Okay.
apparently. So yeah, it's the same all the way across, just simply make sure that you match up with each of those.
Okay.
Okay? Give you a couple minutes to type those in. Now, what you could do, matter of fact, I'll just go ahead and, what the heck? You're going to make the B36 static.
Right.
So if we go, let me just do this. Okay, I'm going to get rid of these three just to prove my point. Okay, so for year 3, I could go over here, come on, and take that times 1 plus B36, okay? But go in and make the B36 a static cell reference. And if I do that, just like that, then I should be able to just take the bottom right-hand corner and copy over those last couple of years. Does that make sense? Okay, just to save a little bit of time. Sometimes I take the shortcut, sometimes I don't. Okay, as long as once again, get the right number, don't really care. Okay, now, year 2, same process. You're just kind of copying over from one year to the next with that growth rate. Okay, and so you can make the B37 static, copy it over.
Okay. Same thing with the
No, in this case it's B37 because we're dealing with the
vacancy rate.
The vacancy rate.
Me too.
Okay, so in this case, what we're doing is we're actually saying that we actually are applying a growth rate to our vacancy rate,
Right.
which we can make some arguments against that, for that, but I'm doing that to basically say the property has got some issues with some vacancies that are getting basically more and more vacancies each and every year, okay? Percentage-wise of income, okay? So in other words, what's actually happening, which is not necessarily a good thing, we've got a growth rate of income of 3%, but a growth rate in vacancies of 4%. Okay? Not a good combination to have. All right?
Yeah.
But thankfully, our vacancies are still a small enough percentage overall that it's not going to be a massive impact. Okay? Okay, everybody got that row?
Yes.
Okay? So the next one, this is going to be our other income.
Why do we have to fill in the 25,000?
Because in the model above does not have an other income line. I didn't choose to put one in there.
Oh.
And part of it, there's actually, you actually bring up a really good question, RJ. Okay. Anybody want to take a guess as to why I didn't put other income in the model above? There's a reason.
Because you don't know. Or you just budget. If you don't budget for it, then it's underneath.
Okay. Both of them is the right thing. So, Kenneth, you want to?
A lender will really consider other income as part of your NOI.
Oh,
See, other income,
I knew that.
if you remember, we actually talked about this, I believe, on the first day, which is that lenders in many cases are going to exclude that other income because it's not core income. Core income being rental income. And so as a result, you tend to kind of exclude it because it's more of kind of like, yeah, it's extra money, it's kind of like found money, but from the lender's perspective, they don't usually use it whenever making a lending decision. Okay, so that's the reason I excluded it. But then down here, I include it because we're partially more concerned about calculating rate of return.
Can you come back one?
To which one?
D36. D37. D37.
D37?
Yeah.
I know, because I'm dragging it, but then all the rest of the stuff.
This one?
Okay?
Drag it the rest of
Yeah,
the
but
stuff.
when I'm dragging, it's,
Once again, if you're gonna drag it over, you're gonna have to make the B37 static.
yeah, I did.
Yeah, it's mine coming off.
The year 5 is 2022.
Make them all 37.
Can you show the D36 real quick? And D37?
D36.
Please, right? Go with the track.
No, these are growth rates.
Yep, yep, okay.
They're being added.
Right?
Okay? All right, what else do I need to show there?
38?
Which one?
Yes.
Okay, moving on, because I'm not hearing anything. All right.
C38.
Okay, so now we're down to C39. Okay, so C39 we've already talked about, that's just adding those up. Now what you should be able to do for basically row 39, you should not have to do any static cell references at all. You should just be able to copy basically, whoops, all the way over. Once you've got the values of the C36, C37, C38, you should just be able to copy over across the page to year 5 without making any adjustments to those.
D38.
Okay. What, I'm sorry?
D38.
Okay. All right. Moving on down. All right, so the 50,000, once again, we're pulling that from above for the operating expenses. So B26 is where we're pulling that from, and we're making the assumption that our operating expenses are going to grow at 4% a year all the way across. All right, so once we do that, we look at, whoops, same sort of thing. Take the previous year, multiply it by 1 plus the growth rate, copy over. Yep.
Oh, actually, yeah.
Look here, the formula, right? When it comes here, the formula is correct, but it was the formula. I don't know what part of it.
Well, you're good. C38.
That was correct, this one.
Oh, that's because you're using, you're not changing the C30, you're using.
This one's it.
You're using the row. You're using that row, not the row right above. Using the wrong number. You need C37. Well, you also got the row right above. You're using C38, C37. Okay. All right, so we've got all the way down to our other income, I'm sorry, our operating expenses, all right, 4% growth rate. Now, from this point, it should be fairly smooth sailing, all right? So we've got, now for cell C41, it's just simply subtracting out C39 minus C40, and then should be able to copy that all the way across to year 5. Okay,
Yeah.
so it should be pretty straightforward. And then in terms of the debt service, that's remaining constant all the way across. However, if you're going to copy it all the way across, you should make both of those static cell references. Otherwise, it's going to potentially copy over other stuff that you don't necessarily want copied over. Okay? And then for this last one, C1 or C41 minus C42, and then you should be able to copy that over. All right? So that should get you everything up to year 5, matching, all the way down to our before tax cash flow.
Can you show me your D42 real quick, just
The
to,
D42.
just to see something? Okay.
Yeah, what I did was I just simply said, okay, instead of making the static cell references, I just said, okay, copy the cell to the left of it.
Okay.
About the last column.
This one, the reversion, we're not there yet. Okay, right now, all I want you to do is to get years 1 through 5 and match up 100% with years 1 through 5. And the easy way to see if you've matched up completely is just to look at the bottom right-hand corner. And if that number is right, you can pretty much assume that all the others are right, because it all feeds into it. Okay? All right?
Should we have the 1,520,000?
Nope, ignore this.
Okay, okay.
Nothing to see here, nothing to see. Okay. All right. Now, before we get into the reversion piece, let's go down to the cash flow piece. Okay? To this part of it. Okay, we're going to have to deal with the reversion here in a minute, and I'm going to get to that, but I'm trying to kind of ease into it. All right. So, first things first. The first column here, equity invested 100%. What I'm doing here is I'm doing 2 different return calculations. I'm doing one that's 100% equity or an all cash deal, okay? So this would be, you've got $1 million sitting in your back pocket that you can just go and throw at a project, not have to borrow any money from anyone, and what would be the cash flow associated with that and the return associated with that. Does that make sense conceptually? Yes or no?
Can you repeat it one more time?
Okay. Once again, the first column is assuming a 100% all equity deal, all cash, no borrowing whatsoever from anyone, and looking at what the cash flows would be from that strictly as an all cash deal. Okay? No debt.
You got
All
it,
right?
Curtis?
The second column is looking at it as it actually is, based upon the model that we created, which is looking at it that we have invested 20% equity
Leverage.
into the deal. We have, in essence, then borrowed 80%, but we are looking at what the cash flows would be, because you're going to see these cash flows are smaller than these cash flows.
Yeah.
But the reason for that is because we have debt, okay, that we've got to pay off each year in terms of our annual debt service. And then you're also going to see that obviously the number that we originally invest, this $1 million represents the total price of the project. Because once again, we're paying everything out of pocket, no debt whatsoever, all equity. Whereas this, we're only putting out $200,000 or 20% in terms of our equity. The remaining 80% is debt. So the difference between the top number of $800,000 roughly is what? That's our loan amount. Okay? Then for the cash flows, the difference between this cash flow and this cash flow is this cash flow is coming from our net operating income, which happens before, well, I have my model up here. Net operating income comes before annual debt service, okay? So this number is higher because you're not taking out anything for annual debt service. You're going to keep all that money that you would have been paying for debt service because you paid all the money cash up front. Does that make sense? Okay? So that gets us down to pretty much, cash flow for years 1 through 4. And you should be able to understand, look at the numbers from above and see kind of where those came from. All right? And we're going to come back to the reversion here in just a second. Let's go ahead and skip on down to the internal rate of return for the holding period. All All right?
Yeah.
Here, this is what we, just like what we did on the first day of class in here, you're just doing a simple internal rate of return calculation for that column of values. So the purchase price, the income stream of the net operating income for the first, basically, few years, and then in the final year, the 5th year, basically what we're doing is we're adding together the cash flow, the operating cash flow of the net operating income with our reversion. Okay, now let's talk about reversion. Okay, the reversion, in essence, is going to be your selling price of the property, subtracting out, if you have a mortgage, subtracting out any sort of selling cost, and that's what you have left over, okay, is going to be your reversion. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's take a look. Now, to get the reversion, though, we're going to have to talk about the cap rate. Okay, so let's go back to that. Okay.
You said the reversion was the selling price minus the mortgage minus the selling cost?
Right, if we have selling costs. But in this model, I don't think you even have selling costs. I think I just have mortgage balance. Okay. All right, so let's go over here for a second and see some extra little calculations I did. All right. First off, I did an extra set of little calculations for year 6. And this is a 5-year model, but yet I did this kind of these extra calculations for year 6. Anybody have any idea why I did those calculations for year 6? Yeah.
To compare what the internal rate of return would be kept a little bit longer rather than selling it.
No.
Because we need the NOI of year 6 to
Yeah,
get the value
the
of
NOI.
year 5 for themselves.
Okay. Right on target. Okay. So the way that you have to think about the income that you use to apply a cap rate to the value of a property is as follows. Okay. Once again, we think about our good friend Irv. All right. This income number in Irv, inherently the assumption behind that income number is it is the income that you are going to receive over the next year. Okay?
Right.
It's not based on past income, it's based on future income. Okay? And it's based on the next year's worth of income. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Right.
Because we always look forward. We're not looking back in this case. And so we're trying to predict what is the income going to be for this next year. Well, but the value, this is the key, but the value estimate in this is what is the value to us today for that income that we would receive over the next year. Does that make sense? So in other words, let me make sure this is super duper clear. All right, so let's say that this is $1,000. All right, and we're generating a 10% cap rate or rate of return on this property. That means the value of this to us is $10,000. Okay, now let me just kind of walk us through the logic. I'm going to write a check to GAN today for $10,000 for this investment.
Yes.
All right. At the end of a year from now, technically, she's going to give me $1,000 back. So to me, that is a 10% rate of return that I have earned on that investment over this next year. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
If you get the $1,000 back.
What?
I was just saying if you get your 10,000 back.
No, not 10,000. If I get the $1,000 back, that is 10% rate of return. In other words, I'm going to potentially do that for at least 10 years to get back basically my original investment. But the idea is we're going to do this continuously from year to year to year to year. But at least upon just a 1-year time horizon, we're simply saying that the annual return for this next year's worth of income is 10%. Okay. All of that to say this. if we're trying to find the value at end of year 5 on a property, we have got to look at the income over year 6. Does that make sense? In other words, we're just looking at it 1 year in advance. End of year 5, we want to know what the value is right now at end of year 5, but we've got to know what the income is for year 6 in order to get that. If we're going to be reasonably accurate with our assumptions.
Right.
Okay? So, all of that having been said, and I'm skipping over this piece right here, skipping forward to year 6. So I just continue on basically with my assumptions over here to year 6 and do the calculations as I would have done them for the previous years to come up with a net operating income number for the end of year 6, which in this case is 143, 558, 82. Okay? Now, what is, in essence, the number or the value that then I'm going to potentially pop in here? Well, let's take a look at what we've got. All right? So come on down here. Let's take a look at this reversion. What am I basing that reversion on? So I-41 divided by E32. Okay, well I-41 is this. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay? But E32, let's go see what is E32.
Reversion cap rate.
Okay, here we go. The projected reversion cap rate, okay? And in this case, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, I kind of pulled that because it's actually an input. It's not an absolute requirement. I think I did it when I was just playing around trying to come up with something that might work and give me numbers I liked. But you can actually, that's an input cell. And so we're just simply saying, what is the rate of return that we would want on that income for our
Exit cap
for whatever the cap rate is that we're going to have on the property. So in this case, I used a projected cap rate of 0.093946. Okay? Yeah, that one you can just type in. Okay? And so that is what we're going to then base our value on for the property at the end of year 5. So it's basically saying I'm wanting a 9.346 rate of return. Okay? Don't try to assume any sort of meaning to that right now, just kind of type it in. All right, so if we do that, that should populate this down here, so the I-41 divided by E32. Okay? All right? Now, the cell right below it, for the annual debt service. This is basically what we're doing here is we're having to figure out what is our loan balance at the end of 5 years that we have to pay off, what I was just talking about earlier, okay? That in order to figure out what our reversion is using debt, we've got to find out what our balance is on that debt at the end of year 5. So that's what the next line item down does. So this is just simply using the future value function to find what is basically the balance on our loan after 5 years. So you can kind of, if you want to just type those in. It's not already typed in. I can't remember now. Did I leave that on your spreadsheet or not?
I think you.
I did or didn't?
You did.
You did. Okay. I think I left a couple of things on there because I figured, damn, what the heck. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. And then from there, you're just simply subtracting out basically the debt from the total reversion. Now, also within that reversion number, okay, we're going to have to eventually add in the 139,325 to that final cash flow, okay? In other words, the final year of the 5th year plus the reversion at the end of the 5th year. This is a question I think, actually, Eduardo had asked me about one of the quiz questions, same general concept, okay? You've got to merge those two together. So, what you're going to see down below for the actual cash flows for each of those scenarios is the G41 plus the H41 for the first one. That's adding in the reversion value plus the final year cash flow of year 5. All right? In other words, the simple way to think about this is as follows. You own a property. Each year, you're getting income from the property. Okay? And so for the 5th year, just like any other year, you're getting the income that the property generated from rental income on the property. But simultaneously with that, in the year of sale, you are also getting the sale proceeds. So you just got to combine them together into one number. That's all you're doing. It's as simple as that. Okay? I mean, the example I used to give many years ago, people, I don't know, they seem to relate to it. I don't know if they do anymore, but basically, like, assume that you buy a coin-operated vending machine that sells Coca-Cola. You spend the money up front for the machine, out-of-pocket expense. Each year, at the end of the year, you go to the coin box, you empty out the coin box, you count all the coins, that becomes your operating cash flow. And then at the end of 5 years, you decide to basically sell the machine to somebody else. That's your reversion. But for that 5th year, you've got to add the coin box collections to the amount that you're actually selling it for to someone else. That's all you're doing here. It's really that simple. Okay. Then for the equity one, same general process. You're doing the same thing, except here you're using the value that excludes the mortgage balance, and you're using the value that excludes your annual debt service payments. So G43 plus H43, all right? Now, once you've got all of that, okay, is everybody matching with the numbers here? Yes? Okay?
Yes.
Now, okay, so let's just talk about these numbers for a minute, what they mean, and then how we can potentially manipulate them. So, if I have hard cash currency, what am I better off doing? Paying cash for the investment or borrowing money for the investment?
Borrowing money.
Under this circumstance, I'm better off borrowing because I'm going to get a higher overall rate of return.
Right.
Okay? Now, but that also, it sort of depends on what are my other alternatives for investment. If I've got no other alternatives for investment, in terms of, like, for example, that my next best alternative for investing is to sink my money into something that's going to give me a 5% return a year. Okay? Everybody follow me on this?
Yeah.
Which one would I be, assuming that I've got the full $1 million is my point. Assume that I have a full $1 million of hard cash currency, and that my next best alternative to this project is a 5% return on my money. So under that scenario, I would actually probably be better off going ahead and taking the all equity deal, because 20% rate of return on all my money is probably better than a 50% return on just 20% of my money, with the other money just earning 5%. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay? So there are, sort of decision points that you've got to kind of think about with respect to this. But, another way to look at this, what if this project is easily replicated? In other words, I could do 5 of these projects. If I can do 5 of these projects simultaneously, then that means I could use my full $1 million, if you will, because I'm only putting down 20% equity. So I could do that, put 5 projects, 20% equity each, and that would be $1 million of total equity. And I would be able to get a 52.6% rate of return over all my $1 million. Does that make sense? Okay, thus the power of leverage. Okay? Positive leverage, not negative leverage. Okay, question?
Is there an equation for that? Because
Yep.
what is it called? What's the model called?
Well, no, this is basically what we went over, I believe, last week. We talked about the weighted average cost of capital. Do you remember that discussion, or were you
It
part
was
of
the first week, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry?
The first week.
Okay, first week.
Yeah.
So the weighted average cost of capital is basically looking at, in essence, the effect of leverage in terms of as you increase your basically borrowing, if you've got a low cost of borrowing, that's going to inflate your overall return on equity. And that's precisely what this is just showing you. Because here's the issue. What is my cost of debt under this model? 5%.
Yeah.
So if my cost of debt is 5%, that's going to have a pretty big influence on keeping that the difference. Well, so what happens, let's say we raise our cost of debt. We keep everything else in this model constant, but I go up here and I raise my cost of debt, or interest costs, to 15%. Let's just see what the flow through is. So we're going to have a fairly significant flow through. All right? Well, it's actually kind of screwing a lot of things up, because I don't really know that's a realistic thing, because that makes our site acquisition cost negative with that particular assumption. Even a 10%.
Why would your return go up if you're?
Well, it's okay. I shouldn't have done that, and the reason why is no. The reason why is because we've got a lot of different variables in play. Okay, and just changing that one variable obviously influences everything else, and so we're going to have to adjust other things to allow that variable change to be relevant. Because by doing that, I mean, it's like for every little percent increase that we have, going from a 5% to a 6% interest rate, that's effectively changing, what the amount that we can pay in terms of the site cost for the property. And so if you get high enough, like 10%, well, it's basically saying somebody should pay you for the site.
Oh, okay.
Have you ever seen one of those?
Yeah.
Scenario?
Yeah, the government does all the time. But you may have a local government that wants to see an area redeveloped, and so they will potentially, in some cases, actually give you the land to actually do the development. And so, yeah.
Do they expect a return themselves?
Not necessarily. And this gets into, these are much more real estate development questions, which I'm perfectly adept at answering, but my point being is they're more geared toward real estate development than they are the real estate finance piece.
Yeah.
But I'll go ahead and give a little bit of an answer. So local governments in many cases will try to spur redevelopment in areas that maybe have been blighted and deteriorating and so forth. And so sometimes they realize that the only way they can get basically development kicked off or stimulated is to do some sort of a market intervention, meaning that the government somehow takes possession and or ownership of key parcels of land or key buildings, and then tries to maybe clean them up, reposition them somehow, and then foist them onto the development community to say, okay, we're going to give you this land or this deteriorated building that has since been cleaned up, got rid of all the asbestos, all the contamination, all that other sort of stuff that you don't have to take on that as a risk. Give it to the developer, and the developer is able to come in and then take that and run with it. And in some cases, it allows the development to occur that would ordinarily never occur. Because, I mean, all of you have probably seen neighborhoods that you're just sort of like, I would never, ever want to build here. I would never, ever want to live here. I would never, ever want to, have anything to do with this. And that maybe at one point, in time, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago, it was a vibrant area, but it's not anymore for whatever reasons.
Yeah.
And so local governments realize that. And part of their role that they can take on is to say, we want to enhance our tax base. And so one way we potentially can enhance our tax base is maybe taking possession of some of those properties, and they usually do so in the form of what they're going to call maybe a community development corporation or I'm sorry?
CRA.
Yeah, community redevelopment agency. There's a lot of different terminology that they can be called, but the idea is they take possession of the properties and then try to repossession them, okay? And so they will, like I said, partner with developers. Now, once again, there are usually strings attached to those sorts of things. That usually they're going to limit what you maybe can do with the property, or how long you have to own it before you potentially can sell it, or what kind of tenants that you may be able to put into the property. You know, a whole list of different restrictions. You know, once again, you know, the whole thing, they're giving you something for nothing, but at the same time, they want something very probably specific in return. Okay? But their whole thing may be affordable housing. I mean, that's a very common government goal, whether it's at the local level, state level, or national level. Affordable housing is a big thing. And so while you, as a developer, are maybe more than happy to take that free piece of land off their hands, or that free, you know, dilapidated building off their hands, you might say, that's not what I want to go with. Affordable housing in this particular location maybe doesn't make any sense. What maybe does make sense is a new hotel, or a new office building, or a parking lot, or whatever it might be. But the local government is saying, no. We want affordable housing, so you're going to be potentially, you know, if you're going to accept that, you're going to have to provide the affordable housing. I'm not saying that that is necessarily a bad thing, just saying that it's a restriction.
Yeah. From your knowledge, I know like in West Coast there's a lot of rental controls, apartments that you can, like, you know, so the prices don't go up for a second.
Yeah, I mean, New York is probably one of the most notorious for that, and the East Coast is New York City specifically.
We don't have any in Florida, right?
Not that I'm aware of.
Right?
Not that I'm aware
But
of.
that would be the same almost as affordable housing?
Yeah, it's
rental control?
It's different. You can have sort of, you can, not necessarily rent controls, but you can have like Section 8 housing or other government subsidized housing that you may be required to, like, for example, a common thing would be, all right, the local government gives you this land or gives it to you at a very low cost, and then they will say, you must provide 20% of the units or 25% of the units as affordable housing units, and then the remaining 80% can be market rent.
Right, like when we did land use class, for example. Right. But the rental control is not the same.
Yeah, rental control is a bit different. Rental control is where you, as an individual, executed a lease with the landlord at some point in the past, and whatever the day that it was executed, it stays that way basically forever.
Yeah.
And then once you die or once you leave, then potentially it goes back to being a market rental. Okay? And so this is why, like, I mean, actually, use a TV show, the TV show Friends, the whole idea was that they were living in a rent-controlled apartment for one of their relatives that had passed on, and but that was the reason why they were able to afford that really nice apartment, because it was rent-controlled. Okay? And they were actually living there under the guise that it was the ownership of basically one of their relatives. Okay?
That would null and void the, like, death doesn't.
It should. But my point is, the landlord has to know about it.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are all kinds of games. I mean, you can probably find all sorts of instances of where the original leaseholder, you know, or the original lessee died, left, whatever, and then the subsequent tenants, related, maybe unrelated to them, took it over as a, you know, rent-controlled property and continued to live there for years without their property owner ever knowing. Okay?
Yep. So, Professor, so in this scenario, right, if I were to be walking in as a developer to a CRA, looking at that negative 13,000, that would be something that you would kind of like reach out for, like incentive or something?
Yeah, well, to a certain extent, but basically, I mean, it's a good number to sort of use there for a second, because you're basically saying to the local government, not only do we want you to give us the land, we also want you to give us an additional $13,000 in other incentives in order for this deal to work for us under these conditions. And see, that's actually a really relevant question, because you as a developer, to a certain extent, whenever you do these sort of deals with the local government, you're going to have to open up your books to a certain extent. In other words, they're not just going to take your word, you know, for, okay, I need to, you know, be given the land, and you know, you're going to have to show them something like this and prove, okay, here is, you know, what my actual costs are. Here is, you know, in essence, yes, I am going. It's not the issue that they're going to deprive you of a rate of return is that you're going to have to demonstrate why, and that it's a reasonable amount, and so forth, so on. Okay? Something that they can feel comfortable with justifying to the public as a whole. Okay? But yeah, those sort of situations happen all the time. Matter of fact, football stadiums, are a big sort of public-private partnership kind of activity. As are a lot of parking garages, as are, I'm trying to think, once again, I already mentioned about affordable housing. Even in some cases, some shopping centers, because there are like some locations that maybe are food deserts, and meaning there aren't really any grocery stores within an area, and so the local government says we really want to try to ensure that everybody has access to fresh food and vegetables and that sort of thing. So we're going to incentivize a grocery store to actually locate here that ordinarily would not locate there because they wouldn't deem it to be economically viable. Okay, but that gets into the more public policy kinds of things that, once again, this class we're not really overly concerned with. Okay. Okay. All right. Other questions? So let me put this back to normal. Okay. I think everything from that point now is back to, yeah. Okay. Double check. Yep. Okay. Are we good? Any questions before we start the little quiz? Okay. No other questions? Okay, let's do the little quiz.
We don't need the implied cap rate, right?
Oh, let's take a look at it. Okay, in this case, the implied cap rate is B27 divided by B31. So B27, let's take a look at that, is taking basically the net operating income divided by B31, which is the overall project cost. Okay, so that's what the implied going in. Actually, this is a good, that you brought that up, because I should actually explain the difference between a going in cap rate and kind of a basically terminal cap rate, or in this case, I'm calling it what am I calling it? The projected reversion cap rate. You're going to hear people refer to the cap rates as, like I said, a going in cap rate, which means the beginning of the project. You're going to hear about the terminal cap rate, or also, as I said, was called the, what's the word I just used? Reversion cap rate. So either the terminal cap rate or the reversion cap rate. So beginning of the project is going in cap rate or beginning cap rate. The end of the project is the terminal cap rate or reversion cap rate. Okay? Now, the difference between the two is that obviously one is based upon the first year's worth of income. The other is based on, as we calculated, like the 6th year or whatever the terminal year is. And so now this is always kind of an interesting question for people to think about. You've got a little bit of a spread there, but not much of a spread. But you're saying at the beginning of the project, your cap rate is higher than at the end of the project. Does that potentially tell us anything? You could interpret it a couple of different ways.
Higher value related to the NOI.
Okay. You could also interpret it, I mean, think about, okay, just ignoring everything else. High cap rate means what? Higher risk. Lower cap rate means lower risk. Okay? So, in one sense, we could sort of interpret this. One interpretation would be, at the beginning of the project, we've got a higher risk because our income is sort of uncertain over the next 5 years. But at the end of all of this, maybe we've got a better handle on what that income is, and I think that's actually how I purposely came up with the lower cap rate. I was always wanting to use that as an explanation point. So that what basically I'm saying is at the end of this project, we've got a 0.5 difference in what that cap rate is, and it's due to, in essence, we're saying that at the end of the project, it's basically less risky. And so we want to sort of use that whenever calculating the terminal value. Okay, make sense? Which actually inflates the terminal value a little bit. Yeah. All right. Other questions? Let's see if I can find a quiz.
What we were already.
No? Not excited. Excited about these later.
I can't imagine that you could possibly get any grade less than 100% on this one, but we will see. We will see.
You'd be surprised.
I'll find out. I'll find out.
Yeah, just give me a few minutes after everybody. We should be done in a couple of minutes.
All right.
I'll try to keep the last bit no number zone.
It's gonna be so hard for you.
It's hard for me. Okay, we got all of them? All right, well, I'll give you credit for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
All right, is that everybody? Yes, no?
Cash. Do you have anything?
Okay, is that it? Final last call. Okay, all right, so we got a little bit of time left over, good thing. I will be letting you go a little bit early, but just hang with me for a few minutes. Wait till we get everybody else back in the room, and I've got a few things we want to talk about. So if you want to grab, if we're staying in the hallway, grab them and get them back in here.
I seen your family video.
Oh, you saw that?
With your email and picture.
All you need to do is take this measure, multiply it by 0.7,
Yeah, you come on in.
and then put it within the cell that is the cost of your construction. So the cell is right below this, you're going to multiply it that by 0.7. On the spreadsheet.
You gotta, you know not to do it.
Yeah.
So, in other words, the cell here would have been the 6246, and I would multiply that cell, whatever it was, times 0.7, and then the answer. It would give you that as your construction cost. Okay. There you go. We're missing over here. Who is that? Jesus. Okay, we got Jesus back. The sooner they get back, the sooner we'll get started. We'll finish. Where are they?
That's it?
Oh, who's over here? This is,
Diego?
Yes.
okay, give them a minute. Okay, so basically what I want to do now, I can talk about some non-class stuff since we're basically done with the class thing. We can talk a little about mentorships, we can talk about some of the other things, and so obviously for those of you that, were in the program, for the last half of the term, I sent out the announcement about selecting your mentors, and hopefully by now, those of you that selected your mentors and I gave you hopefully one of your top choices for the mentors, tell me about what's happened since then.
I've been in contact and we're getting together this week.
Okay, who was it?
Friday, Fina.
Okay, gosh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I met Jessica Jolie Friday.
How'd it go?
Very good, actually. I went to the actual spouse. She asked me where you wanted to meet. I said I actually want to meet in your office. So I want to see the development and how the whole thing works. So I went to Styles.
Okay.
It was pretty cool.
Any insights from it?
Yeah, we talked for a lot, getting to know each other a little bit about what I do, how I want to get the best out of this program, and how she can help me. And next month she's supposed to take me to like a project that they're doing maybe, so she can illustrate kind of like visually of how everything is working.
And she comes into our real estate development class and helps us out with a whole number of sort of site visits and information. Styles has always been a very strong supporter of the program and has been really helpful in getting us some really awesome site visits, and she has been instrumental in helping with that.
Yeah,
so,
she was very informative. Yeah,
she's really good.
Yeah.
Okay, who else? That's it?
I contacted Tony. We are scheduling the first.
Okay, so you haven't had your first meeting yet?
No.
Okay, anybody else? RJ?
Yeah, I met with
Harry Posen?
Harry, yes. I met with him in his
Okay,
office.
so tell us a little bit about it.
It went well. I guess we just went over like what was on the packet, just like goals and stuff like that, and just, I don't know.
So any insights from him?
As far as
Just anything?
Yeah, no, I mean, he gave me, I guess, a lot of good advice. We're meeting up again next month.
It was really influential, the swap analysis you gave us there, kind of like to make notes of those 4 things. That was really helpful. I filled it out and I took it with me.
Yeah. The reason I wanted to talk about this a little bit, because this, in my mind, is one of the key components of the program if you take advantage of it. It's one of those sorts of things that, yeah, you can go through the whole program, never have a mentor, never get in contact with a mentor, never, go through the process, but it is an amazing opportunity if you take advantage of it. I mean, these are all senior level people within the industry, and in most cases they, some of these folks have been in the industry for, 30, 40 years, others are a little bit maybe younger, but the point being is they've got experiences that they're wanting to share with you and wanting to potentially help you out and make connections within the industry and to help you, kind of figure out the best way to kind of, point you with regard to what it is you want to accomplish. And so you really, I mean, I know you're potentially stretched for time. I mean, you've got obviously your classes you're taking, you've got your jobs, you've got your families, you've got all that sort of stuff. But I really can't, help to, or I really can't stress how important I think it is that you connect with these folks and try to, get that extra little bit of assistance in terms of, in some cases it may be as simple as they point you in the direction of people that are going to be perfect for you to get to know based on what it is you want to do. If you go in and you say, I want to develop industrial property in Miami, chances are that mentor or one of the other mentors is going to know precisely who to put you in contact with, and as opposed to you maybe even trying to have to figure it out. So, use them in that respect. I mean, what they're not meant to be used for, however, is you're not meant to go and ask them for jobs. That's not their role in this. Their role in this is to provide advice and, counsel about, kind of your career and your aspirations. And also I would say, don't be afraid of reaching out to them, on a continual basis. They'll let you know if they've had enough of you, they're not shy people. And you know, there are a lot of type A personalities within the group that are definitely going to be very blunt about what they think you should do or shouldn't do. And so you should, once again, take that advice and run with it. But they're all great people. They've all agreed to to spend the time working with you. And so all I can say is make sure that you take a look at the manual. Make sure that you reach out to these folks. Don't leave them hanging in the sense of wondering, are you ever going to contact them? And then also, I suppose the other piece to this is that if you do meet with one of them, and for whatever reason you feel like there was absolutely zero connection that took place, and you never want to see them again, or whatever, for whatever reasons, let me know, and we'll get you assigned to somebody else. But don't just kind of abandon the situation and not say anything about it, because once again, these folks really are genuinely interested in helping out. So any of you that may have been in the program a little bit longer, I know, Gayon, you've been in the program for a little bit longer, and I know you've had maybe at least maybe one, possibly two mentors. I'm not really 100%.
Just one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who was your mentor? Was it?
Trella.
It was Trella.
Trella.
Okay.
But then I moved. So I moved away, and our second meeting was at the YOLO meeting last year, and he was going through some personal things, and I was going through some stuff. So it'd be good for me to reconnect again now that I moved back.
Right.
So.
Anybody else? Obviously, Dustin.
Yeah, Harry Posen has been a great mentor. I've met him a couple times, usually for drinks down at 401. He buys. That's good.
Better.
And split a bottle of scotch with him and talk about things. But he was also good at getting me in touch with a few people. Like I just so happened I was trying to get in touch with somebody at Minto, which is a home builder that Harry used to run.
Right.
So I asked for a contact there, and he said, "We'll call Michael Nake with the CEO." I hired him. He'll probably take your call. So. I mean, I knew he'd know somebody, but I didn't know. CEO. That's right.
Harry's an amazing guy. But all right, anybody else? Other? Yep.
I had Craig Perry.
Craig Perry.
Yeah. So
it's
been good. I know at least once a month we usually
Good.
over at Sunway, Commerce Center. Cool guy, very informative, very knowledgeable.
I like him a lot.
On a lot of things. And I learned a lot from him, really. But it's just like, I don't know, now I've been with him for so long now, for a whole year now, that it's kind of more so we don't really talk on the more like, I guess the format of what we're supposed to, but that's for sure.
Yeah, and once again, these things, potentially can take on, different lives of their own in terms of how they, get structured over time. But, the general idea, as I said, it's really meant to be a career enhancement opportunity. Is the idea behind it. Just trying to figure out ways that they can, hopefully offer up advice and insight. Okay. All right. So one of the other things that we probably, I think there's a handful of you that are going to be going on the Cuba trip. So we're going to have an information meeting about that on Monday night. 5:30. At 5:30, I think upstairs in 3048, I think it is. If there's anybody, I think we may still have one space available for the Cuba trip. It's going to be December the 11th to the 15th, and the cost that you've got to come up with is $500. Okay, the actual cost is about a little over $1,000. But if you want to go, we still, like I said, I think we still have one space available. All the rooms this year, just so happens on the ship we got an upgrade, so they are all exterior rooms with windows. So they are not the porthole, or not the interior rooms that are like closets. So that's going to be taking place. So if any of you are interested in that, please let me know, and I'll get you on the list. Let's see. Obviously, in the spring, we're going to talk about the spring study tour that we're going to try to do during spring break. And that one, as I said before, we're going to make that all inclusive, so you're not going to be out of pocket for any additional cost on that one. And then, I was trying to think, RJ, are there any other events coming up in the short term that anybody should be going to? The networking events, or?
Let me check my calendar real quick.
I think you emailed us a sheet.
Yeah, I did last week.
Okay.
Yeah, he emailed everything there, all the events in there. So.
Now make sure that you take advantage of those. I mean, it's one of those sorts of things, whether you're like me and you don't like to go out and talk to people, that's fine, but you sort of need to do that.
Is that
it's part of your career. to, you know, obviously get to know some of these different folks and hopefully, once again, you know, through those connections, are able to help move your career along. So, you know, definitely consider those. What else have we got going on, RJ?
Well, next week, or the coming up week, there's not really any events, but the one after that, we have, a big one is the South Florida Idea Exchange. That's a 2-day one.
And that's one with ICSC, isn't it?
Yes, and for those who I emailed about ICSC membership sort of a deal, if you email me back, I got you free admittance to that. It's $125, so. So if you're one of the 5 people who email me back, you got.
Can you still email
I
you?
think it was Diego, Dara. I can't think off the top of my head.
Huh?
Ed, did you?
Can I email you now?
It's too late. But that's a big one, and that's on the 15th and 16th.
And also, I mean, RJ and I are going to be going to what was the Home Builders Conference?
Yeah, it's in January.
Yeah, so if those of you that are interested in the home building thing, and it's actually in Orlando, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would strongly, I mean, while our program is not really focused on single-family, you know, home building, the National Association of Home Builders Conference is amazing. There are very few conferences I like to go to because I don't like people. So, you know, this is one of those conferences that I really, really like because it's all about the product. I mean, and it is amazing. I mean, it's just like so
When is it?
many different. It's
January, I think 9th off the top of my head.
I think the January 9th is the first day of coming back though.
Yeah.
Also, on top of that, when I sent out like a little 1-question survey type deal about home building, if you answered, we're just finishing up the paperwork essentially, but you're now members of the National Home Builders Association, so you get discounted rate to that.
It's really, and when I say it's about the product, I mean, it's every possible conceivable, like everything from faucets to roofs to flooring to all different kinds of insulation and materials. I mean, it's just, and then built up, you know, they actually build things on site. I mean, it's just, it really is a very interactive, interesting, and it's massive, okay? It really is. I don't want to undersell it. It's one of those, if you've really got any interest in home building or residential construction, it's well worth going. It really is. Okay, anything else, RJ?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of it off the top of my head.
Okay, any other questions from any of you about anything? Are we all good? Good? Okay, so for this class, before I forget, so obviously next week, we've got the construction spreadsheet that we'll be doing, and so what I've decided to do for this course, there are a total of 8 class sessions, and so to kind of help you out a little bit, I am going to drop your lowest quiz grade in this class. So instead of having 8, you will have 7, okay? So just so that you kind of keep it in the back of your mind, so that it gives you a little bit of a cushion if you didn't perform well on one, that you've got a little bit of something to kind of fall back on, okay?
Last week's quiz, if we got it, I heard that the answers that we gave you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll be giving you the final version of that
Okay.
in terms of the graded version of that. And then, so maybe like next week, what I probably will do is then give you what your current average is so that you are kind of
Like a midterm grade kind of thing?
Well, there's no midterm this time.
I mean, like in 4 weeks, 8 weeks
Yeah,
kind of
something
thing.
like that. Okay? All right.
Don't give him my
Get out of here.
Sorry. Did you want this? Keep this.
I don't remember off the top of my head if you emailed me that. I think you did though. I think you did. I'll have more information. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, that's just one miss. I actually don't know. I know that there are protocols out there, but I don't know. I would still contact them, because I actually had somebody come in and say something else. Lewis, before you, so how did all the contacts go with like SEBA Group and the others? Sorry about that.
No, you're good. I appreciate it, guys, because obviously I got them all. But I don't want to go.
Yeah, I got that email. I was about to open it up.
Yeah, and everybody else got my spam email too?
Hold on a second.
That was,
I'm so sorry. Gentlemen, sorry.
for, I'll let you guys know.
Actually, it depends. It depends on what you want to do. You can go and not send it for request, you can go and send it for request. And yes, you can. But the information session, if you email send you the don't worry about it. It's going to be 5:37. Yeah. No, you don't. Unless you want credit for it. Then
Well, I do. Okay, so I need an internship credit.
you got a choice. You've got to figure out what you want to do. If you want an internship, you want internship credit, you got to sign up for the internship. If you want to do cruise and get credit for cruise, you got to sign up for the classes. But you can't do both. You can do either the cruise or the internship.
Oh, man.
I am not requiring you to sign your class to do the cruise. Yes. Yes. But show up on Monday. Just, yeah, send me an email so I can reply back to it.
You got to learn finance or investments at the same time.
Okay. No, I was saying like, every time that comes up here, so like a couple.
Mira, Ray, quisiera que entraran con él, que haya una sesión. ¿Lo crees que vaya? ¿A querer? No, no feo.
Right.
And they had called.
Pero que dice de reconozco
They called. Nobody was paying the invoice to my mother. And she's handing it, so. Oh, by the way, you have to remortgage stuff out of my mom. I'm doing that. Yeah, okay, that's gonna be good.
Okay.
So that's why I couldn't meet up with him. I got in a panic that night or the next day.
Gotcha. Yes, sir.
Actual answers to the quiz. If I do the problems out myself when I email it to you, will you email me back to let me know if I did it correct or not? Just a simple yes or no. Doesn't have to be the answer.
I mean, I can give you some more time because I'm going to have to stay here to upload the video. So if you want some more time to work on and do that.
And what room are we meeting in?
I think it's 3048, but let me just,
Oh.
let me see.
Oh, shit.
Thank you, Professor. I appreciate it.
What is your email address? It's not playing up on my thing. Is it D? Oh.
Yeah, DS434 MSU.over.
43. DS434?
Yeah. I just emailed.
Yeah, what is this? I'm sending it to you though. Okay, let's see. Files.
You in the military profession?
No. Well, that's just from the barbecue place down the street.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see.
Is this from the first class?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I did. Obama was on the first one. Yeah, I did too.
Are you gonna drop all those quiz grades? Like,
Well, that's why that you do the test, is then that replaces the,
Oh, they don't have that option.
right.
gosh.